When I came home early from vacation to find a huge hole in my backyard, I was ready to call the cops. But the shovel at the bottom made me pause, setting off a chain of events that would change everything I thought I knew about treasure, friendship, and what truly matters in life. Karen and I had to cut our beach trip short because she caught a nasty stomach bug. When we arrived back home, all I wanted was to crash on the couch, but I figured I'd better check on things outside first. "What is this?" I muttered, inching closer to the edge. At the bottom lay a shovel, a water bottle, and some other junk. My first instinct was to call 911, but then a crazy thought hit me. What if the digger knew we were supposed to be away and was coming back? I turned to Karen, who was looking pale. "Hey, honey, let's park the car in the garage. Make it look like we're still gone." She nodded weakly. "Whatever you say, Frank. I'm going to lie down." As night fell, I set up camp by a window, peering out into the darkness. Hours ticked by, and I was about to give up when I saw a shadow leap over our fence. My heart raced as the figure crept toward the hole and dropped in. This was my chance. I crept outside with my phone in hand, ready to call the cops. As I approached the pit, I heard grunting and the sound of metal hitting dirt. The digger looked up, squinting in the light. My jaw dropped. It was George, the guy who'd sold us this house last year. "Frank," he said, sounding equally shocked. "What are you doing here?" "I live here, remember? What are you doing in my yard at midnight?" George's face fell. He climbed out of the hole, looking sheepish. "I can explain. Just please don't call the police." I crossed my arms. "Start talking." George sighed. "My grandfather used to own this place. I found out recently that he hid something valuable here. I thought I could dig it up while you were away." "So you broke into my yard to dig for treasure?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I know how it sounds," George said, "but it's true. Look, I'll make you a deal. Help me dig, and we'll split whatever we find. 50-50. I should have said no. Should have called the cops right then. But something in George's eyes, desperation, hope, maybe both, made me pause. "Fine," I said, "but we fill this in when we're done, treasure or not." George nodded eagerly. "Deal." #hashtag the dig. We spent the next few hours digging, swapping stories between shovelfuls of dirt. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. George shrugged. "Not sure. Could be cash, jewelry, anything really." Grandpa was paranoid about banks. As we dug, I learned more about George. He lost his job recently, and his wife was sick with cancer. "This treasure," he said, "it could change everything for us." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Life's funny like that. One minute you're struggling, the next. "Exactly," George said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. We kept at it, the cool night air a blessing as we worked. Every so often, one of us would hit something hard, and we'd both freeze, hearts racing. But it was always just another rock. "So," I said, trying to keep the conversation going, "tell me more about your grandfather. What made you think he'd hide something here?" George leaned on his shovel, catching his breath. "He was a character, my grandpa, always talking about the government and how you couldn't trust banks. He'd tell these stories about buried treasure and secret hiding spots. And you believed him?" I asked, not unkindly. George smiled sheepishly. "Not at first, but then I found this old journal of his. It had all these cryptic notes and sketches of the property. One page had this big X marked right where we're digging now. I had to admit, it sounded intriguing. What do you think it could be?" "In my wildest dreams? Gold coins or rare jewels," George said, his eyes lighting up. "But honestly, I'd be happy with anything at this point. A few $1,000 could really help us out." I nodded, understanding all too well. "Yeah, I get that. Life's expensive these days." We fell into a rhythm, digging and talking. George told me about his job loss and how the company had downsized without warning. I shared stories about Karen and me, our struggles with the house finances, and our hopes for the future. As we worked, I felt a connection forming. Here we were, two guys from different walks of life, united by the possibility of buried treasure. It was absurd, sure, but also kind of beautiful. You know, I said, pausing to stretch my aching back, even if we don't find anything, this has been, I don't know, kind of fun? George looked surprised, then grinned. Yeah, it has, hasn't it? Thanks for not calling the cops on me, Frank. We both laughed, the sound booming out in the night air. But as the sky began to lighten, that hope faded. We dug halfway to China and found nothing but rocks and roots. George slumped against the side of the hole. I really thought. I was so sure. I felt for the guy. Hey, it was worth a shot, right? Come on. I'll give you a ride home. Hashtag the ride home. We started filling in the hole with a few shovelfuls of dirt, but then gave up and piled into my car. It turns out George had caught a cab over to my place. The drive was quiet, both of us lost in thought. When we pulled up to George's house, a woman rushed out the front door. This must be Margaret, I thought. George, she cried. Where have you been? I've been worried sick. George climbed out of the car, looking like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I'm sorry, honey. I was just... Margaret's eyes narrowed as she spotted me. And who's this? I stepped forward, extending my hand. I'm Frank. We bought your old house last year. Recognition dawned on her face, quickly followed by embarrassment. Oh no, George, you didn't. George hung his head. I'm sorry, Maggie. I really thought. Margaret turned to me. I'm so sorry about this. My husband's been, well, he's got this crazy idea about buried treasure. It's not crazy. George protested. My grandfather? Your grandfather was a storyteller, dear, Margaret said gently. Remember what the lawyer said about his estate? George looked deflated. But I was so sure. I felt like I was intruding on a private moment. Look, no harm done. We'll just need to fix up the yard a bit. Margaret nodded vigorously. Of course. We'll pay for everything. Again, I'm so sorry about all this. There's no need to pay for anything, I replied. The exercise will do me good. And besides, my wife and I have been talking about a pool. Maybe now's the time. Margaret laughed at that, and as I turned to leave, George caught my arm. Frank, thanks. For everything. I smiled, giving his shoulder a squeeze. Don't mention it. And hey, if you ever want to grab a beer or something, give me a call. George looked surprised, then grateful. Yeah, I'd like that. Hashtag the aftermath. As I drove home, I felt disappointed. Sure, but I also felt a sense of connection. George's desperate hope had been contagious. Karen was up when I got back, looking better but confused. Where have you been? And what happened to our yard? I sat down next to her on the couch and told her everything. By the end, she was shaking her head, but smiling. Only you, Frank, she said, kissing my cheek. Only you would spend all night digging for treasure with a stranger. I laughed. Yeah, well, maybe I did find something after all. Karen raised an eyebrow. Oh, not gold or jewels, I said, but a reminder that sometimes the real treasures are the connections we make, the stories we share. Karen rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. That's cheesy, even for you. Maybe, I admitted, but I was thinking, why don't we invite George and Margaret over for dinner next week? Karen looked surprised, then thoughtful. You know what? That sounds nice. But first, you're going to fix that hole in our yard. I groaned, but couldn't argue. As I headed out to survey the damage in daylight, I couldn't help but smile. Life might not have buried treasure waiting around every corner, but it did have its moments of unexpected adventure. And sometimes that's treasure enough.